everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have folks who are joining us live for this session, and then quite a number of folks who plan to be watching when we share this out later. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Eric Ferrero. I'm the Executive Director of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, which provides grants to journalists to do investigative stories that have an impact. I'm really excited that we're bringing you today this latest in our ongoing series of impact investigation discussions, this one focused on immigration. And I am particularly excited and thrilled that we are co-sponsoring this together with Palabra, which is the National Association of Hispanic Journalists platform to tell stories and stories from journalists who are often disregarded or have too few platforms, and is really an incredible outlet and resource. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers who we have today to share some of their experience and insights with you, and then we're just going to dive into the discussion, and we're going to welcome your questions and interaction too. So to begin with, today, you're going to be hearing from three teams of folks who have recently published stories with grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. One of those is Jenny Manrique, who has launched a series actually on air COVID, looking at how US deportation flights have seeded coronavirus in Latin American countries. And that series, the first piece was published earlier this summer on Palabra, and additional pieces are yet to come. We're also joined today by William Martin and Enrique Unzueta, who are joining us from Tijuana, Mexico. And they recently published a piece in the New Humanitarian on how US asylum policies and practices are endangering LGBTQ people in Mexico as they're forced to stay there. And so the two of them are joining us for this discussion, and we're especially grateful for that. And last, but definitely not least, we're thrilled that Silvia Viñas is with us. Her story, Jay versus United States, which aired on Radio Ambulante, looked at a number of individuals, a number of women who say they were sexually assaulted in US immigration custody. And she reported that incredible story, and we'll share more of it with us. We're going to be led today in this discussion, and we are so, I think, fortunate to have him with us to lead this and share some of his own experience and insight with us. Ricardo Sandoval Palos, who I think many of you know already, serves now as the public editor at PBS. He's also the managing editor at Palabra. He's on the Fund for Investigative Journalism's advisory board, which barely begins to describe his role with the fund as really a leader and as somebody who has built the Fund for Investigative Journalism into what it is and continues to do so. And so we are incredibly grateful to all of them for sharing their time and their experience and their insights today. Ricardo, may I turn over to you?
Thank you, Eric, and welcome everybody to this, what I hope to be a very fruitful conversation. And it let you know up front that we're gonna hopefully leave an ample space for y'all to chime in with some timely and pertinent questions to this discussion. I'm glad that we're here talking about this because as we get to the end of summer, and I think we can all agree that it's been a pretty horrible summer for pretty much everybody in the country, right? And worldwide. It's a record-breaking year for terror, and I'm talking about personal terror, and just the challenges that we're all facing as people, as societies, as communities. There is a particular interest now, I think, in presenting stories, the likes of which that you all have put up recently. And it has to do with immigration. It has to do with vulnerable communities and how a certain group of people is particularly predisposed to suffer in this time of pandemic. And which is why I really appreciate the work that you all have done. And it's good that we're here to focus on it. I also want to point out that one of the important things about this is that, you know, I'm an immigrant myself. I was born in Tijuana. I was raised in San Diego in California. I went back to Mexico after I became a U.S. citizen to be a foreign correspondent for the Dallas Morning News and Night Raider newspapers. I spent 10 years living in Mexico City. All that time writing about, thinking about, being about an immigrant. And it is really impressive to me to note that I can say without a doubt that immigration is probably, if not one of the most complex and difficult things to write about that's on the landscape in front of journalists today. Reason being, the laws are complex. The situations are complex and complicated. There is no cut and dry, you're either for immigration or you're against immigration. There is no line. So when you hear someone say they should all go back and get in line, there is no line for the majority of immigrants, especially from Latin America, which is why it's vital that we have these kinds of stories that do the following: separate myth from from reality. So objectivity for us in covering immigration has to be about writing about reality and separating that from myth and pulling back curtains on what I think is a lot of myth that surrounds this issue. So I'm glad that we're all here. And we're going to start, I think it's really important to start by looking at the why. I mean, a lot of you know who I am and how I am as an editor. Jenny will certainly attest to the following, that I'm a real stickler on two things that set you aside from a lot of stuff that's being put out these days in news coverage and on immigration. Why and how. Tell me the why and the how of the story, and I think you've achieved what is critical to investigative reporting today, okay? So for you guys, and we'll call it a jump ball, see who wants to start us off, is tell me why these stories, why did you select the subject that you wrote about? What was it that put you on the path toward completing these investigations? Who wants to begin?
I can start. I think mine is the oldest one, so maybe I'll kick it off. I started looking into the story in 2017 when we got an email from the ACLU telling us about this case that they were looking into, about these two young women, Guatemalan women, who said that they had been sexually abused, sexually assaulted by a CBP officer in a border patrol station. I was immediately interested, of course. I had a lot of questions, you know, what exactly happened? I really wanted to know what exactly happened at the border patrol station, how the case was internally investigated, if any disciplinary measures were taken against this officer, and then I had, of course, the bigger questions of, is this part of a systematic pattern of sexual abuse in the agency? And how does the agency usually handle cases like these? And is anything being done to deal with cases like these? So I was awarded this grant to try to find those answers. And I think, as it happens with investigations, the questions changed and as the investigation progressed and they evolved, I guess is the right word. But the why for me was that I thought this story really combined two very timely issues facing the US, and not only the US, but the world, which is the Me Too movement and allegations of abuse of migrants, and especially minors, because the girls, one of them was a minor when this alleged abuse took place, and the abuse by immigration officials. Both matters that are, you know, of great public interest, and I thought the story at this particular time really allowed us to look at these two issues, how they play out in the biggest law enforcement agency in the US. So that was my why.
Okay, Jenny, you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually found this story through a press release. I mean, that was kind of my initial curiosity, let's say. And sometimes with agencies that work in immigration like ICE or CBP, it's interesting why they say in their communication and why they don't say. So I got this press release about, these deportation flights that they call repatriation flights, in which they were bringing back American citizens trapped in other countries because of COVID, right? So they were these humanitarian flights type of thing. But the reality is that the same planes were using in the leg back to Latin America to bring deportees. And I got this press release just saying that in a humanitarian flight, some Americans were coming back to the States, and that this flight were to Colombia. And I am from there, and just like sparked my curiosity, starting from there, thinking like, how many people were in that plane? Because what ICE had been sharing so far, and still does, is the people they return, the repatriation flights, right? And so from there, it was like this curiosity, just like who was in these planes, how many of them, in which condition they was translated, when. And this was end of March. So we were knowing like more than obviously the first months of the year, but less than now about the coronavirus, right? So how is this happening? How is these people translated, and their wish health protocols and their wish safety protocols? And I just have the idea because of previous ICE behavior, let's say, in the prisons themselves in the United States, or in other transfers, because immigrants are transferred from prison to prison within the United States. I'm not just talking about deportees. That there might be some lack of care, and that because the coronavirus was new for everyone, that might be some outbreaks here and there. And then there was some news about outbreaks in ICE detention centers. So from there, I would just start to just check with Colombian sources and friends, even family, if they hear about this flight. And I found one piece in local media about one of the deportees talking about that they were infected. Some of the deportees in the flight were infected, and from there start like a path to talk to this person and then the others. And just like, it was kind of a time where all of them kind of wanted to talk, but at the beginning they request anonymity, what we can grant it obviously in certain stories. But then they start to like open up with me, and then we just come to a point with the story. If you have the chance to read it so far, they just disclose their names and basically even took selfies for me, given the fact that I was not able to travel to Colombia because of the restriction, and just tell the complete story. But I will say that the why was basically understanding what ICE is telling us and what is not telling, when they're just sharing with journalists the piece of information they want.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. And William and Enrique, what was the spark for you guys? What was that thing that set you on the path?
I think similar to Silvia, our story changed quite a bit as well. We were first interested in reporting on immigration at the border in January 2019 when the Remain in Mexico policy came out. And Ricardo, I think similar to what you were saying earlier about how there are these communities who are more impacted than others, we really wanted to focus on the LGBTQ asylum seekers in Tijuana. So we started doing research for about 6 to 9 months, looking at these communities. And at that point, Enrique and I started working together, and he was on the ground here in Tijuana and was able to access a lot of these communities.
Yeah, and I have to agree wholeheartedly with you, Ricardo, that, when it comes to immigration, it's very confusing, and it kind of becomes, myth versus fact. But I would perhaps add to that the fact that in reality, there's a landscape that changes rapidly with the policies that change, correct? And that landscape is here in Tijuana. These policies are American, and but the changes that are visible are in Tijuana. And I think that's the why for me, because we can't stop at, oh, here's the new policy. I think what was very important is to show the full story and how like real communities that are very vulnerable are being impacted in real time. So yeah, the LGBTQ community for us was very visibly impacted, and it was, you know, one of the most, the ones that suffer the most danger in a country like Mexico, in a city like Tijuana. And I think that that's why, right?
Yeah, and our project changed from examining queer people who were impacted by Remain in Mexico to queer people who were ultimately impacted by the US immigration border policies during COVID. So they're stuck in Tijuana, in a border city for months at a time, with little to no resources, facing discrimination as immigrants, and also because of health complications, they're more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19.
Thank you, thank you. And you know, one of the things that's really struck me is, you know, writing about immigration now for more than 3 decades, is seeing how little newsrooms have changed in regard to how a lot of editors, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will understand what I'm talking about here, is that editors come to you and say, okay, well, this is good, but you know, we're tired of hearing about victims. And what's the other side in immigration? And I always ask myself, why do immigration reporters get this kind of pushback? What is the other side? It's not like, for example, someone who's writing about politics and money is the other side that, hey, we like corruption. So is that the other side? I mean, it's almost a false equivalence that is put in front of you. How do you all deal with this perception that as immigration reporters, we're often biased, or that we can't cover our own communities? What is it that allows you to be able to go to editors and say, no, hey, it's more about access. I know these communities, let me in there. Do you have those kinds of conversations with editors? Have you had those kind of conversations? Silvia?
I'm very lucky to work with Radio Ambulante, so yeah. I don't have that problem. but to answer I guess the first part of what you were talking about. So I worked on my investigation alongside a mentor, apart from the help that I got from my editors at Radio Ambulante. And he is, I think it was good to work with him because he's this British journalist who was able to look at the story from very far away, literally, geographically, but also someone who maybe doesn't follow as close as we do these issues. So he asked me, you know, have you talked to Border Patrol agents? Have you talked to, you know, and I would say, yes, I've emailed and I've tried to get interviews with officials and they all say no, or they don't answer, or they ask me to send in questions and then they don't answer them. And he said, yes, but have you talked to Border Patrol agents? And, you know, so, you know, he helped me see, you know, it's important to get that side, you know, as you were saying, sides of the story. So what I did, maybe I'm jumping ahead here with the tips, but I used LinkedIn, which I've only used LinkedIn for to find sources, not for what it's meant to be, which is networking for a career. But I was able to find former employees there from CBP and former Border Patrol agents, and the older ones who had recently retired were a lot more open to talking to me and telling me how things had changed, because I wanted to know what had happened when this zero tolerance policy on sexual abuse had been implemented in 2014, 2015. So I wanted to find Border Patrol agents who had been there and who had seen this change and who had seen the surge of hires. So that really helped me kind of get that side, as you were saying.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in the realm of challenges, I mean, think about it. There's no more monumental challenge to what we're doing than a restriction on travel, a restriction on being proximate to other people. How do you pull off these stories in these pandemic conditions? Jenny, it looks like you're back with us, I think. Or it looks like you're frozen, actually. But while we work that out, let's ask William and Enrique how you do the work and how you've been able to follow up in this pandemic. I mean, how do you do it?
So one thing we were very concerned about was, because we're video journalists, was working with subjects who might be immunocompromised. And so we were very careful during the development of COVID-19 in the spring to keep a distance from our subjects, as well as protecting their identity. So we ended up having a video project that not only obscured the identity of the subject that we were following, but also we had to deal with distances between us and them for safe social distancing filming. And I guess the number one lesson we learned was to get tested frequently and to continue being on top of social distancing.
Also, I should say, luckily, we had access to a lot of information that came from outside the country, because, you know, at the time we were doing this, it wasn't necessarily a rapid response from the government locally. So it's a responsibility to actually be on top of things and kind of plan ahead. At the time earlier in the spring, I should say, things weren't shut down yet. COVID was a concern, but it was not the reality that we live in right now. So yeah, like I guess the way to get through this is just stay informed, you know, take all the cautions that you can, and yeah, and just respect both the lives of your subjects and, you know, your own, because I think it's important work.
We also made a list of, it was kind of like our 10 commandments of how we would try not to be extractive as journalists. And so each subject or lawyer or activist we worked with, we sent this list of non-extractive policies that we were abiding by. So we were trying to not do parachute journalism. We were trying to be there, embedded, investigating in the story for more than 4 or 5 weeks. We told them that we wanted to hear from them after the article was published. So we had a whole list of these things that we were committing to as journalists to try and fight back against parachute journalism. Reporting in Mexico, when you have a lot of white journalists who come in and do a day's worth of reporting and then leave. And I think that really helped us establish ourselves in this community, especially during COVID, when many journalists were using that as a reason to step in and step out quickly.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really critically important, is knowledge of the community and access. And Jenny, I think this is a real key to your reporting, is which I think for many other people, it would have been impossible to find the people you found who had been infected with COVID on the plane, probably, as they landed in Colombia. Describe that process and how you got over that difficulty. And I think it has to do with access, right? And local knowledge, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so one of the advantage, let's say, that I had is, like, I am Colombian, of course, and I know somehow like why these issues can be important for them to speak about, in the sense that Colombian government is really not responsive in terms of why there was their role in receiving these deportees, and not even the Ministry of Health there either. Like, knowing a little bit about the local authorities and how frustrated these immigrants felt about not having responses, and how even sometimes from that frustration, there are people that are more willing to speak to the press and that were there to listen. So that's one thing that is important. On the other hand, I have to say that when you were mentioning about the challenges of the pandemic, is like, I not just have to interview them by WhatsApp or Skype or phone, etc., but they were during their own quarantine. They were recently diagnosed. They were spending their 14 days sick. So I have to be with them while they were with these terrible coughs, not knowing actually they were going to be getting worse, because again, by that time, that was end of March. So we didn't know much about the disease as we know now. And even though we can, you know, at this point be more knowledgeable about, I don't know, treatments or type of care, not by then. So they were even very scared about each other of the immigrants, and they were asking me how were they, because I was the one who were talking with 7 people at the same time. So they were very scared about themselves, about others. And they were like in this, we were in this communication in which they were asking for if these other people were translated to their communities, because they were passing the quarantine in Bogota, in the Hospital Militar, or in the Hotel Tequendama. And I was interviewing them in these places. And I think that what was challenging was like, just kind of trying to be with them during the illness on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to get as much information as possible in our calls, and trying to obviously plan several interviews ahead, and letting them to know that what was the reach of the publication too, because sometimes I think like, okay, I'm gonna tell this and, you know, I'm gonna be, I don't know, you know, I'm gonna have attention from the government, or maybe I'm gonna receive an indemnization from what they did to me. And at the end, I was just trying to explain what was the reach that we could get, and that they were really needed a lawyer, and they need like other, you know, like, let's say other people involved that was just beyond my capacity of what can I do with the story. And on the other hand, it was just like this thing of building trust that, you know, for you guys who do work on the field, and you go back once and again to a community, and we can do that. And our way is the phone. Even though that's kind of a limitation, the fact that you're calling and chatting and asking, and basically asking from just human point of view, like, how are you? I mean, you've been really locked in a place that is not your city, you're not with your family, you're just deported after 6 months in a nice detention center when they also didn't know anybody. So it's kind of like a lot of moving on their grounds. So if you on the other side are kind of telling the story, if you can show some compassion, that really helps. And I think, again, that with the limitation, that's how you build trust these days. So, and one thing I want to mention that I mentioned in my previous answer, like, we get to a point in which I couldn't send out, like, even if we hire a local photographer, because we could, but they won't be able to be photographed because they were in quarantine. So we just talk about, you feel comfortable sending a selfie wherever you are, and that we're going to use this selfie for publication. You know, it's probably not as we want in a professional, you know, setting of a photograph to accompany a story like this, or a web story, but they were on board with that too. So I think the communication flows so well at the end, because they felt that somebody was paying attention.
Thank you, Jenny. And I would like to second the notion of the selfies these days. They come in really handy. And I think in our stories and some of the other stories that we put on Palabra that have featured selfies, it's almost a mirror, because isn't a selfie kind of telling you a little bit about how the individuals see themselves? And I think it really helped us in that storytelling. But 2 key things that I saw in the 3 stories that we have before us today is use of data and the humanization of that data. Describe for me the importance of the data that you collected and that you were able to use to underscore the human stories. And would you agree that perhaps that they're probably as equally important, or is one to you more important than the other? All right, Silvia?
I think it's hard to say. I think they're equally important, but I think that's hard to say. For me, data was very important because the agency is so opaque. So I had to rely a lot on what had already been released, and the year that I wanted to look at was a year that they had not published yet. They were behind a year. They do this, they're supposed to do this yearly review of sexual assault cases, how many they have, how many are substantiated, etc. And the year that I was looking at, they didn't have it. They released it right before I published the NPR Weekend Edition version of the story, which is shorter and in English. So we were able to add a line from that there. But there was a lot of data that had been collected by the ACLU and other organizations. And that was key for me because all the information that I was getting from the agency was, I mean, all the FOIA requests that I made would not be answered, or they would be returned with scenes. So the super important.
You gotta love Zoom, right?
How often does this happen, you know? Yeah, so for me it was key. I think the story wouldn't be complete without it.
Okay, thank you. And before we move on to William and Enrique, I just want to remind you, if you've got questions, let's start putting them before Eric so we can get everybody into the mix here. Dialogue with you all is critically important to the success of these conversations. So Enrique and William, I mean, for you guys, you know, this is an area that has it's a difficult data story to tell. Yet you guys had some interesting numbers in there. But what's critical to your story is the human element, the human, the people involved in this, because that is, after all, the most vulnerable of the people in this community. I think were the folks that were front and center to your story.
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak for Enrique, but I have a background in like filmmaking, photography. So these character-based stories are always what I'm most passionate about. But like we talked about, the data really substantiates what we're finding. So we started with the character-based stories, and then the lawyers, the activists, the shelters on the ground were the ones who were backing up these stories with this incredible data of how many other people have been impacted in a similar fashion. And so, you know, I would say they're equally important, the data versus the humanization of the data. But for us, it certainly was a challenge finding that data, but I think it really, really helped solidify what we were working with. And the interesting thing on reporting on the LGBTQ community in these border cities is that it's hard to track that data because there's such a lot of LGBTQ asylum seekers won't report that they're part of the queer community. They feel endangered doing so. So the data was a bit limited, but once we were speaking to these activists and the lawyers and the health officials who were treating these LGBTQ asylum seekers, we were able to build a broader picture of what was happening to them on a ground level.
And I guess I'll say for me, I actually think that, you know, I couldn't possibly sort of assign importance to one versus the other. It's more like data is basically the map, any which way you see it. The lack of data is the map. Too much data is the map. Data points to where the story is. However, I think that the human element in the story, that's what you're pointing your camera, you're writing, you know, your story to, right? So you can't stay with the data. That's insufficient. That's not what this is about. You're telling the stories, you're reporting, you're investigating because you want to find the human behind the numbers. So to me, it's like this. You can't have it. It's both, you know, at the same time.
And the interesting thing is we got a lot of pushback. I mean, it took us maybe 6 to 9 months to really establish trust with enough of these lawyers and activists to gain access to the asylum seekers who are being protected for good reason, obviously. And once we were able to gain access to the asylum seekers on the ground and of course, protect their identity, protect their health by social distancing, we were really able to capture their story in a way that allowed them to feel like they had a say in what's happening right now. And so I think we're most proud of the work in terms of giving, not a voice, but giving a platform for people who are normally behind the scenes to speak about what's happening, and especially with health officials and lawyers, because they normally aren't reaching out to the media and they're normally not speaking about what they're discovering on the ground. And yet they're this incredible wealth of information that seems to be often untapped.
Thank you. And Jenny, before we jump into the questions from the audience or the participants, tell me a little bit about the data that really bolstered your reporting and how difficult it was to obtain.
Yeah, I think like for this type of reporting, it could be equally difficult to find the sources and the data. I mean, but I think definitely the starting point is having the human stories, because we have a lot of numbers and many stories on the web, or people who are reporting on these issues when we can get a hold of some, FOIA requests that maybe other colleagues actually been through for years, and then you say, oh, I finally have this now, how this is affecting this community. But maybe when you get to the story to the other side, you already will have this voice that is so valuable and that will just actually tell you something else beyond that numbers. But having said that, obviously the numbers just can give you the magnitude of what is going on. And with these agencies that are just take all the time they want to answer to you, months, years, or maybe not even answer, I think like my communication with them was just more like giving them the opportunity once and again, and basically week after week, like, hey, and sometimes even I said like, hey, we have this deadline, but we move it because we think it's important that you have to say on it. I said that several times. So basically week after we moved the deadline, because I was just thinking like, and there was actually someone responding on the other side saying, I'm collecting it, but I need the, approval of the supervisor, et cetera, et cetera. So it was not also like a dead end. We were communicating. And actually it was surprising for me that at the end, ICE gave me the data. And it took like probably 2 months, which is usually a short time, given the fact that the time they, take for answering these requests. And they gave me the data with all the deportees in the months I was requiring and the countries they were sending to. And it was just, and I remember telling Ricardo at that point, like, hey, we got the story, look at this. There are more than 10,000 since the pandemic began. That's insane. Who is talking about these numbers, et cetera, because we were talking a lot by then about the conditions inside the ICE detention center, but not about the deportees themselves and where they were going and what was happening in those countries that they were already devastated by the virus. So being able to do those links and actually say that, these numbers reflect a problematic that is getting like so gross, let's say, in terms of what is going on in the detention centers. And then we're just kind of reproducing that lack of care in the flights, back to their countries once they get to their countries. So it was kind of a chain in which there are a lot of responsibilities of, local authorities and etc. And people affected by all that lack of care. Like you can follow, you can track in a way what is going on and where. And I think like ICE at the end, they didn't give me all the data that I wanted, but they start to change the protocols in the way how they were deporting people, like basically just having masks, these little basic things that there was not even happening in the first deportation flights at the beginning of March. So they felt kind of encouraged to share more, because they actually at that point want to show like, hey, we're just trying to do things better. So look, these are the new protocols. Like it just, the story was evolving by the time that the protocols were changing and that ICE was more willing to kind of cooperate with our story. So it was important to having the data, but definitely having the stories in the first hand were just what makes it powerful.
Well, that's great. And you also bring up something that's really critically important to FIJ and to me as an editor as well, is impact. And as we go to the first questions, Eric, I want you all to think about that question of impact, okay? Because I'm going to come back around and ask that. So Eric, I think we have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. We've got some stuff coming in from the live participants and then a couple that were emailed in advance. To start with Leslie Crenshaw, who's with us in the live webinar. She has a question for any of the journalists on the panel, which is whether or not you have advice for sourcing primary accounts for these types of stories. For example, how can a journalist go about reaching former deportees or victims of abuse from agencies like ICE and CBP? How do you actually find some of the human individuals at the center of these stories?
Silvia, I think that you could probably lead us off with that one.
I think going to organizations like the ACLU and others who have done research about these cases can be very helpful. They're usually very open about that, about helping you reach them. First asking, of course, if they're willing to talk, and then putting you in contact with them. I was able to talk to, I wanted to know about other cases that had gone to court of women who had accused agents of sexual assault or abuse. And I was able to find a woman I didn't speak to because the case was open, but I did speak to her lawyer, and that really helps me understand that case and see how that had, how it differed or how it was similar to what I was doing. So talking to their lawyers can also be helpful.
Okay, a quick one to Jenny. How'd you get their phone numbers? I mean, these are folks who are already back in Colombia. You're stuck here in the US. It's a real challenge to try to put a human face on that kind of a story and to get that kind of access. I mean, this is a good way of giving a tip on that, in that regard, I think.
Yeah. So this was the story, the biggest story that there were Colombians infected was reported by a local media. So I reached out to the journalists and say like, hey, I see that this person talked to you. This person ended up being kind of a leader within these immigrants because they spent the quarantine in a military base, and they were having like a lot of issues once there. And he just kind of behaved like a leader within this community there, like just asking for sanitary products, whatever. So I first interviewed him, and he was really open since the beginning. And then I say like, okay, your story is very powerful. I'm really sorry that all this happened to you. Do you think that on any others of your companions in this flight will be able to talk? And then he just reached out to some people. Then I reached out to some people. But I have to say that the first help was with the local journalists back in Colombia. Yeah. And just second what Silvia was saying, like definitely NGOs that work with migrants, shelters, like, human rights defenders, they're really pretty much on the ground all the time receiving these stories. And they actually are very good allies with media because they want this to be known. And they sometimes are just really just doing the work, or actually just providing the first aids they need to connecting these immigrants with lawyers or whatever they need. And they are really willing to help when a journalist approaches them.
And William and Enrique, I would imagine that being there is critical to get at the question, right? Especially in your case. Yeah.
Absolutely, but I'll say, like, so in our case, it's very sensitive profiles that we are dealing with, because these are people who are actively seeking asylum. So there's a bunch of legal caveats that come with trying to present a story like this. To get to those people, you have to like jump a lot of hoops, and sort of you have to reach out to your network. That's the bottom line, and you have to present yourself the most honest possible way and tell them straight what you're trying to do, which is I'm trying to show the story, and this is what I can and cannot do. And I say this because I'm a local producer here, and I found that the person you've worked with before, normally they always have a lead, but it takes taking that lead and sort of familiarizing yourself with the organizations, reaching out several times, never taking no for an answer, showing them that you care. You're not just there for the photograph or for a headline, and show up. It's harder now, COVID obviously, but show up at the door, knock a few times. tell them this is me, and if it takes that much, you know, like you have to get to know me, this is what I do, like present yourself. That's the way we gained access. I mean, I will say, obviously, I was introduced to, we were introduced personally to a couple of the leaders and organizers, but ultimately gaining the trust of the subjects who are the ones that matter, that's the work, that's the climb. Yeah.
Okay. Eric, do we have any more questions up there?
Yeah, we had a question in advance from a reporter based in New Jersey who was asking about whether any of you were working on follow-up pieces. And Ricardo, it was asked a little bit in the vein of the impact question that you were starting to get at earlier, and kind of, I think she was asking about the difficulty of sometimes the difficulty of seeing impact in these stories because the system is so big and, as you know, Silvia noted, so opaque. And as follow-up coverage, one of the ways that we see impact with these stories.
Yeah, Silvia, I think it's a good question to ask is, how do you measure impact with something like the story that you put out? I mean, in my mind, for example, impact would be, boy, they would issue more U visas, perhaps. And if you all know what a U visa is, it used to be a good tool to offer immigrants the ability to become normalized and regularized if you help prosecutors pursue a criminal or a suspected crime. And, you know, so there are these subtleties involved in these kinds of stories. And I'm wondering, how would you measure impact in your kind of investigation?
I think that's really hard when you're dealing with an agency like CBP, especially now under this administration. I think to me, so I had, going back to this personal story issue that we were talking about, when I set out to do this investigation, this story, I really wanted to talk to the young women. That was the number one, you know, people I wanted to get their story from. And then, and they had agreed to speak, but then they changed their mind. And I had to decide, does this story die with this, or do I keep going and talk about the agency still with the personal story, because I did have access to the case records, which basically said what they were going to tell me, what I was going to ask. And I think that hopefully personally for them, knowing that we kept going without re-traumatizing them has impact. We did learn right before the Weekend Edition story came out as well, that the agent was still working at the agency. So that was something that we could unearth, that when I did the story, I couldn't find out, but CBP finally answered at least that question, that they had opened an internal investigation and they had closed it because they couldn't find any physical evidence, and that the agent was still working there. And you know, the lawyer who I had been in contact with didn't know that either. She found out about that through us. So that was my little victory for me, that we were able to tell this story without re-traumatizing the young women, and also find out a little bit about what had happened in this specific case that hadn't been revealed before.
Right. And William and Enrique, how would you measure impact in a story on a project like yours? I mean, we're talking about human beings here, right? So how would you summarize that all-important question about impact?
I think there are three noticeable ways in which that there's been impact on this piece. First of all, and I think what we're most proud of, is the asylum seeker that we're following, Alejandra, who's still stuck here in Tijuana. Because of the piece, she was able to send the 11-minute video as well as like the article to different organizations in the US who work in immigration law and sponsorship. And she's already received offers from several of these organizations who are willing to take on her case when she goes into Otay Mesa, if she does, as well as offer her sponsorship. So on a human level, that's fantastic because it did just what you said, Ricardo. It humanized the data. We also had several of the law organizations here in Tijuana, like Al Otro Lado and a few other organizations who, because of this article, and at first they were skeptical of the reporting, but then they supported it. Because of the work, they're now using it to teach classes in Tijuana about what's happening with immigration and putting a human face to the data. And then third, the new humanitarian who we published with, they've been tracking the data on who's watching the video. And it seems like the largest demographic or the largest amount of views have occurred in Mexico, which is particularly positive because there's a fair amount of discrimination against Central American queer asylum seekers in border cities. So we don't know if Mexicans who are watching the video are being educated or watching the full video or changing their mind, but at least we know that this information that we have is being disseminated to an audience here locally.
Okay, great. And Jenny, what's changed since you launched into this?
Well, I think like by the time we were reporting on this, ICE was changing some protocols. So I think that it could have been as a product of this story and others that were reporting by other colleagues here in the States too. And the fact that the deportees are tested before the flight, that's a huge victory. I don't know if it's just for this story, or as I said, as a map of others reporting too, but I think that's very important. And as far as Colombia, they changed the protocol of flights there, because then the second flight after this big story, like this big number of infectees, then the Ministry of Health, by the first time, even something that we quote in the story, he was saying like everybody was tested and everybody was fine. And that was a lie, just a big lie. And then for the second flight, they were tested here in the States, and then they were tested back in Colombia. So I think this little change, protocol, health protocol change is huge. As far as the Colombians, they are really, some of them are trying to organize and just, they have talked profusely with a lawyer about like just basically just take a lawsuit against the Colombian government. I can say that that's happening now because some of them are afraid and these things take time. But that was like kind of their initial, that was the initiative. They have the impulse of saying like, this was so wrong for wherever you see it, because they couldn't get to their communities after 30 days after the flight, etc. So I think that there is a sense of community between them, like just pointing out at the stories that they feel like this was so wrong for all of us that we need to take a further step. And in terms of ICE, they've definitely been changing protocols. There are still things happening, and with that, I want to invite you to read the second part of the series. We're just gonna bring in stories from Brazil and Guatemala, and but there are little twists that you can say like ICE is paying attention to something that reporters are doing, and that's good.
That's great. Well, listen, I think we're getting close to the point where we have to wrap this up. Final thoughts, real quick, from the group. Anything that you're really anxious to say before we cut you off? All right. We got William over here. Thank you, William.
I just wanted to say thank you, Silvia and Jenny, for some of your tips, because we definitely hadn't considered using LinkedIn to track down prior CBP officers. So we're definitely going to do that for our next story that we're working on right now.
That's great.
Great, thank you.
Hey, listen, Eric, you've got something for us?
I'm sorry, Ricardo. I was just going to say, to make sure to share with folks that you can go to fij.org to find application deadlines for grants, both for the rolling grant programs that we have on COVID-19 and police misconduct, as well as the regular grant deadlines. We are very interested and eager to continue supporting more stories like the ones you've heard about today. Thanks, Ricardo. Just wanted to get that out.
And I just want to say thank you, first of all, to PBS for continuing to allow me the time to work with freelancers such as yourself, an independent journalist, via this amazing vehicle that we have now at NHJ with Palabra. And if you're not familiar with it, please go and check it out. It's for you all. I'd love to see proposals. We're all about providing a platform for any kind of deep dive, feature stories. Where we are really into telling stories about people who traditionally don't have their stories front and center. And that's what we're about. And I thank you also to the folks at NAHJ for putting this platform up and acknowledging that more and more of us are independent and freelancers, either by choice or by what's happening to our industry. Hey, continue to do the great work that you all are doing. Thanks everybody for being here with us. And let's do this again sometime. Boy, this is fun. Eric?
Ricardo, thank you. Can't thank you enough for your leadership and leading us through such a rich discussion. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.